Greetings, Paul Deeds here. I think when most people hear the term Vietnam veteran, they think of a man in green fatigues carrying an M16. And while there were a bunch of those over the years, there were also a good number of support staff involved in the Vietnam War as well. And I was among the support staff. I was not a combat veteran. Some of the estimates of the ratio of combat troops to support troops was as high as 10 to 1. 10 times as many support troops as there were actual combat troops. In 1968, there were over 530,000 troops in Vietnam total, which is no small number to be sure. While we may have been in the combat zone, many of us were not very close to actual combat itself. I was what was referred to as Blue Water Navy. That means I was on a ship off the coast of Vietnam, as opposed to brown water Navy, which were the guys on the riverboats. And that's something I'm very conscious of making clear whenever I talk to anyone about being in Vietnam, is that I was not a combat troop. Whenever that conversation comes up, I refer to myself as Blue Water Navy, just so my brothers and sisters know what my position was during that time. And that's, like I said, out of respect for the people that were doing the heavy lifting inland. After my boot camp at Great Lakes Training Center in Illinois, outside of Chicago, I went home on leave for a week and then went down to Pensacola, Florida for training as a communications technician. After A school, I came home on leave for another week or so and then shipped out to Vietnam via Clark Air Force Base in California. That made one quick stop in Anchorage, Alaska, and another quick stop in Hawaii, and I'm not sure where, and then ended up in the Philippines at Subic Bay. All sailors, almost all sailors know Subic Bay in the Philippines. I guarantee all lifer sailors know Subic Bay in the Philippines. And if I said Olongapo City, they'd know exactly what I was talking about. But that's a whole nother story. The ship I was assigned to was the U.S.S. Jamestown. At the time I made it to the Philippines, my ship was off the coast of Vietnam. It was on station. So what I ended up doing after a couple of days in transit there in Subic Bay was to board a transport ship. Well, it was actually an oiler, but it was transporting half a dozen of us to the Jamestown. So we boarded the Chipola in Subic Bay, and it made its way over to Vietnam for our transfer to the Jamestown. The primary duty of the Chipola, the ship that was transporting me, was to replenish ships at sea. And when we made our way over to the coast of Vietnam there, that's what we did with the Jamestown. They transferred some lines across ship to ship, and this was all underway. Both the ships are going at a slow speed side by side. And while they were refueling the Jamestown, those of us, the half dozen or so of us that were transferring to the Jamestown, were transferred by High Line. And my recollection is this was at night, because I distinctly recall them putting us in the High Line chair in a life jacket and attaching a bunch of lights to us, and then sending us across on the High Line, which was pretty exciting. And I remember getting to the other side, to the Jamestown, and being met on that side by a first-class bosun's mate, a good-sized Mexican fella, a lifer. And I remember him noticing that I was a CT, a communications technician, and I remember his words pretty distinctly. "Oh, great, another effing CT." So that was our welcome aboard to the Jamestown and our welcome to Vietnam, another effing CT. I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a certain amount of resentment between the regular crew of the ship and the CTs, because the communications technicians were dealing with classified material. We all had top secret security clearances, and the spaces where we did our job, where we worked, were restricted. They were restricted to people with top secret security clearances. So most of the crew was not able to go where we could go, and they didn't like that very much. I can't say that I blame them, but it's the way it was, the way it had to be. In fact, there was a time when our executive officer, I don't know if he hadn't been cleared yet or he just didn't have a top secret security clearance. And when he needed to come in to do an inspection in our spaces, we had to do what is called a sanitize. We had to cover certain pieces of equipment that were top secret, and we had to make sure there were no documents out that were classified and whatnot before he could come into our spaces. Executive officer is the second in command on a ship. So you can imagine how he felt about that. The Jamestown mission was primarily as a surveillance platform. Our job was searching for communications and radar activity in our area of operation. Most of our time, or most of my time, I should say, aboard the ship was in the southern area of Vietnam. A lot of our time was spent close to the Cambodian border, um, the border between Vietnam and Cambodia, which was very, very south and west, I guess you could say. I say most of our time, or a lot of our time, was spent around An Thoi, Vietnam, which I think An Thoi has now actually been taken over by Cambodia and is now a resort. Go figure. We also spent some time a little farther north around Vung Tau, which is outside of Saigon Harbor. And also a little bit, we made a couple of runs up to Cam Ranh Bay, which is just a little south of Nha Trang, if you know Vietnam at all. Our area of operation was all off South Vietnam. We had a sister ship, the U.S.S. Oxford, that worked the northern areas more. I made the rank of E4 while I was aboard the ship, which in Navy speak is Petty Officer Third Class. It's just a worker bee. Didn't have to do some of the lesser jobs, but still did my work. Still had to work. We all worked in shifts, what they called the eve day mid. You'd work 2 eve watches, 2 day watches, 2 mid watches, and then have a period of time off. Of course, during that period of time off, you had other things that you had to do, work parties and studying for your next rank and whatnot. You didn't have wasn't a lot of free time to yourself. When you're on the mid watch was always interesting because you had to do your sleeping during the day when everybody else was running around. And the berthing areas on the ship we were on were 3-tier bunks, rows of 3-tier bunks. And I started out on the top tier when I first came to the ship, and it was right under an air conditioning vent, and that was miserable. So first chance I got when another bunk opened up is I grabbed it, and I ended up on the bottom bunk, which to me was the best one to have. As I recall, we were usually at sea for 45 days at a time. And then after that 45 days, we'd go to different ports for liberty for our R&R, if you will. There were a few times during our 45-day at sea period where we would go in closer to shore and have a little R&R. And that involved taking landing craft onto shore for a little beach party, a little volleyball and cookout. And I remember there were a few cases of beer involved. And we had some R&R for the afternoon. Obviously, it was a safe area to do that, but we still had guards posted, armed guards posted during our period there. And I remember there being a lot of helicopters going back and forth. When we were on the beach, there was a fenced area there, and I remember some prisoners being moved from one point to another. During my time on board, we managed to make it to Hong Kong, was my first Liberty port. Also made it to Bangkok, Thailand, Singapore, like I said, Subic Bay in the Philippines, where I had been when I came over to the ship. We managed to get back there a couple of times. And then ultimately, the boat I was on, the U.S.S. Jamestown, was decommissioned in Japan. So the ship's final port was in Yokosuka, Japan. And that's where I left it to go back home. There are just countless stories to tell about my time on the Jamestown in Vietnam and about my time in the service in general. So like my previous video, this is just going to have to kind of serve as an overview, and perhaps I'll do some videos, more detailed videos in the future. If you have a story of your own that you'd like to share, by all means, leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear them. If you're one of the heavy lifters, Thank you. Welcome home. Peace and joy.